America's Shattered Mirror. Section 1. The Inherited Dream. The dawn of a new frontier. The decade of the 1960s did not begin on its own terms. It began in the long shadow of the 1950s, inheriting a nation of profound and often unacknowledged contradictions. On the surface, America was a picture of placid prosperity, a black and white television dream broadcast from a booming suburbia. The economy was strong, the baby boom was in full swing, and the quintessential American image was one of chrome-laden automobiles, manicured lawns, and a confident paternalistic president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, presiding over an era of apparent peace and stability. It was the age of conformity, of gray flannel suits and unquestioning faith in American institutions. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, the currents of anxiety ran deep. The Cold War against the Soviet Union was a permanent feature of life, a low-grade fever of dread punctuated by moments of acute panic. School children practiced duck and cover drills, a futile ritual against the unthinkable horror of thermonuclear annihilation. The launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik in 1957 had delivered a profound psychological blow, creating a national panic that America was falling behind its mortal enemy in science and technology, a missile gap that became a potent political weapon. Furthermore, the gleaming facade of prosperity concealed deep structural inequalities. For millions of African Americans, particularly in the segregated South, the American dream was a cruel mirage. They lived under a system of racial apartheid, known as Jim Crow, a brutal regime of legal and social oppression that denied them the right to vote, to receive a quality education, or even to share public spaces with white citizens. This other America was largely invisible to the mainstream, a problem most of the country preferred to ignore. The nation was a house divided, not just by ideology, but by the color of one's skin. It was this complex inheritance of prosperity and poverty, of confidence and anxiety, of declared liberty and practiced oppression that awaited the new decade. It was a nation ripe for change, a society holding its breath, waiting for a catalyst. That catalyst arrived in the form of a young, charismatic senator from Massachusetts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. In 1960, JFK announced his candidacy for president, and in doing so, he seemed to embody the very spirit of a new generation. He was young, handsome, wealthy, and witty. He represented a stark contrast to the grandfatherly Eisenhower and his Republican heir apparent, Vice President Richard Nixon. Kennedy's campaign was built on a promise of vigor, activism, and a forward-looking dynamism. He spoke of a new frontier, a call to action for Americans to conquer the challenges of poverty and injustice at home and to stand firm against the threat of communism abroad. The 1960 presidential election was a pivotal moment in American political history. It featured the first-ever televised presidential debates, a new medium that played perfectly to Kennedy's strengths. While those who listened on the radio thought the experienced but weary-looking Nixon had won, the millions who watched on television saw a different story. They saw a cool, confident, and photogenic Kennedy next to a pale, sweating Nixon, still recovering from a recent illness. Image, for the first time, had become as important as substance. The election was one of the closest in American history, with Kennedy winning the popular vote by a razor-thin margin. His victory signaled a generational shift in power. In his soaring inaugural address, delivered on a frigid January day in 1961, he laid out the idealistic vision of his administration. He pledged that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, and he issued a challenge that would define the era's early ethos. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. He spoke of paying any price and bearing any burden to assure the survival and success of liberty around the world. The speech was a masterpiece of rhetoric, a call to service and sacrifice that inspired millions. With the Kennedys in the White House, the presidency itself was transformed. The White House became Camelot, a place of culture, glamour, and youthful energy. It felt like the dawn of a new golden age. Yet the inherited problems had not vanished. The Cold War was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and the simmering struggle for civil rights was about to explode into a national crisis. The high ideals of the new frontier were about to collide with the brutal, unforgiving realities of the world, and the journey through the 1960s would prove far more perilous than anyone in those hopeful early days could have possibly imagined. The fire last time, sit-ins and freedom rides. While the Kennedy administration was settling into Camelot, another, more urgent American story was unfolding far from the glamour of Washington, D.C. It was a story being written not by politicians, but by ordinary college students, ministers, and sharecroppers in the segregated South. The struggle for civil rights was not new, but in the early 1960s, it entered a new phase of direct, confrontational, and profoundly courageous action. The catalyst came on February 1, 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 black college students from North Carolina A&T State University, Zell Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil, walked into an F.W. Woolworth's department store, purchased some school supplies, and then sat down at the store's whites-only lunch counter, politely requesting to be served. They were, of course, refused service, but instead of leaving, they remained in their seats, quietly reading and waiting until the store closed. They returned the next day with more students. By the end of the week, hundreds of students, both black and white, were participating in the sit-in, enduring taunts, threats, and physical abuse from white mobs without retaliating. The Greensboro sit-in was a spark that ignited a prairie fire. The tactic of non-violent direct action spread with incredible speed across the South. Within months, tens of thousands of activists were conducting sit-ins in over 100 cities, challenging segregation in lunch counters, libraries, parks, and beaches. This grassroots movement led to the formation of a new vital organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, pronounced SNCC. Comprised of young, impatient, and fiercely dedicated activists like Diane Nash and John Lewis, SNCC was committed to forcing change from the ground up, often operating independently of the more established, legal-focused civil rights organizations like the NAACP. They practiced a philosophy of nonviolence, learned from leaders like Reverend James Lawson, who taught workshops on how to endure physical and verbal assault without fighting back, a strategy that was both a moral statement and a brilliant political tactic. The images of well-dressed, peaceful black students being dragged from counters, spat upon and beaten by furious white mobs were broadcast on the national news, exposing the raw ugliness of Jim Crow to a horrified nation and the world. In 1961, the movement took its next daring step with the Freedom Rides. Organized by the Congress of Racial Equality (CORE, the rides were designed to test a recent Supreme Court decision that had outlawed segregation in interstate travel facilities, including bus station waiting rooms, restrooms, and restaurants. On May 4, 1961, an interracial group of 13 activists left Washington, D.C. on 2 buses, bound for New Orleans. Their plan was simple. At each stop, they would deliberately violate the local segregation ordinances. They encountered resistance and violence almost immediately, but the journey turned truly horrific in Alabama. Outside the town of Anniston, one of the buses was ambushed by a Ku Klux Klan mob. Its tires were slashed, and as it tried to escape, it was firebombed. The Freedom Riders barely escaped the burning bus before being brutally beaten by the mob. In Birmingham, the second bus was met by another Klan mob at the bus station. With the full knowledge, and some historians argue, the complicity of the local police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, the Klansmen were given 15 minutes to attack the riders with baseball bats, iron pipes, and bicycle chains before any police arrived. An FBI informant in the Klan later reported that Connor had assured them, "I don't have a man in sight. You can beat 'em, bomb 'em, do anything you want." The shocking violence, particularly the images of the burning bus, made international headlines and created a major crisis for the Kennedy administration, which had been focused on the Cold War. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, horrified and embarrassed, scrambled to protect the riders and quell the violence. But the original riders were too injured to continue. It was at this moment that the young activists of SNCC, led by Diane Nash, refused to let the movement die. Nash argued that if violence were allowed to stop the rides, the movement would be set back for years. A new group of SNCC students traveled to Birmingham to continue the journey. They were arrested, driven to the Tennessee state line by Bull Connor, and abandoned in the middle of the night. Undaunted, they made their way back to Birmingham and boarded another bus for Montgomery. There, they were met by yet another white mob that beat them senseless, inflicting life-threatening injuries on several riders, including John Lewis and a Kennedy administration official, John Sigenthaler, who was there to observe. The crisis finally forced the federal government to act decisively. Robert Kennedy sent in federal marshals to restore order and pressured the Interstate Commerce Commission to issue a clear, unambiguous ruling that banned segregation in all interstate travel facilities. The sit-ins and freedom rides were a baptism by fire. They demonstrated the incredible courage of the activists and the depths of Southern resistance, forcing a reluctant federal government to intervene and setting the stage for the even larger, more dramatic confrontations that would soon follow. On the brink, the Cuban Missile Crisis. This section will pivot to the Cold War, focusing on the most dangerous 13 days in human history. It will begin with the backstory, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961, which humiliated the Kennedy administration, and the subsequent Soviet decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. The narrative will build suspense, detailing the discovery of the missile sites by U-2 spy planes. The core of the chapter will be a tense, day-by-day account of the secret deliberations of ex-com, the group of advisors Kennedy assembled to handle the crisis. We will explore the intense debate between the Hawks, who advocated for an immediate airstrike and invasion, and the Doves, who urged a naval blockade and diplomacy. The section will climax with the naval quarantine in effect, the downing of a U-2 over Cuba, and the back-channel negotiations that ultimately led to a secret deal. The Soviets would remove the missiles in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a private promise to remove American missiles from Turkey. The episode will conclude with the profound realization of how close the world had come to nuclear annihilation, a trauma that would shape the rest of the decade. A dream articulated, the March on Washington. This chapter returns to the Civil Rights Movement, focusing on the pivotal events of 1963. It will begin with the Birmingham Campaign, where Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC targeted the most segregated city in America. We will detail Bull Connor's brutal response, unleashing attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses on peaceful protesters, including children. The shocking images from Birmingham galvanized the nation. This section will cover King's famous letter from a Birmingham jail, a profound defense of civil disobedience. The narrative will then build towards the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August 1963. We'll explore the logistics, the political maneuvering, and the initial fears that it would turn violent. The climax will be a detailed account of the day itself, the 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, the speeches, the music, culminating in a deep analysis of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, a moment that represented the moral peak of the non-violent movement. The end of Camelot, the Kennedy assassination. This section will chronicle the national trauma that ended the era of innocence. It will begin with President Kennedy's political trip to Dallas in November 1963, aimed at healing divisions within the Texas Democratic Party. The narrative will be a minute-by-minute account of the assassination in Dealey Plaza, told from multiple perspectives: the Secret Service, the crowds, the journalists. We will follow the immediate, chaotic aftermath, the rush to Parkland Hospital, the swearing-in of Lyndon B. Johnson aboard Air Force One, and the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald. The focus will then shift to the 4 days of national mourning, the indelible images of Jacqueline Kennedy's stoicism, the horse-drawn caisson, and the funeral. The section will conclude by exploring the profound psychological impact of the assassination on the American people and the rise of the countless conspiracy theories that reflected a nation's inability to accept that such a monumental event could have such a simple, senseless explanation. The Great Society, LBJ's War on Poverty. This chapter focuses on Lyndon B. Johnson's ambitious and often forgotten domestic agenda. We will explore how LBJ, a master of the legislative process, used the memory of the martyred JFK to push through a tidal wave of landmark legislation. The centerpiece will be the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which dismantled the legal barriers that had prevented African Americans from voting. But the narrative will go further, detailing the full scope of the Great Society. We will cover the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, Head Start, the National Endowment for the Arts, and sweeping environmental protection laws. This section will portray LBJ as a complex, tragic figure whose incredible domestic achievements would ultimately be overshadowed and destroyed by his decisions in a war half a world away. The quagmire. America goes to war in Vietnam. This section details the fateful escalation of the Vietnam War. It will begin with the historical context, the French colonial war and America's initial involvement as advisors. The narrative will then focus on the pivotal Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 and the subsequent, nearly unanimous passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Johnson a blank check to wage war in Southeast Asia. We will detail the internal debates within the Johnson administration as advisors like Robert McNamara and McGeorge Bundy pushed for a gradual escalation. The section will chronicle the decision in 1965 to launch Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, and the deployment of the first U.S. ground combat troops, marking the moment America's role shifted from advising to fighting. The chapter will end by explaining the initial strategy of search and destroy and the dawning grim realization among officials that this would not be a short or easy war. The Jungle War, the soldier's experience. This thematic chapter will shift focus entirely to the perspective of the American soldier, or grunt, in Vietnam. It will explore the unique nature of this war, a war with no front lines against a largely unseen enemy, where distinguishing a civilian from a Viet Cong guerrilla was often impossible. We will detail the daily reality of patrols, the terror of booby traps and ambushes, the oppressive heat and jungle environment, and the psychological toll of a one-year tour of duty, where the main goal became simply to survive and go home. The narrative will explore the erosion of morale over time, the rise of drug use, and the concept of fragging, the killing of unpopular officers. Using letters, diaries, and veteran interviews, this section will provide a raw, humanizing, and apolitical look at the immense sacrifices and suffering of the young men who fought the war. Fire in the streets. From civil rights to black power. This chapter chronicles the splintering of the civil rights movement and the rise of a more militant, nationalist ideology. It will begin with the Watts riots in Los Angeles in 1965, a shocking outbreak of urban violence that signaled a shift from the rural South to the urban North. We will explore the growing impatience with the pace of non-violent change and the rise of the Black Power slogan, articulated by SNCC's Stokely Carmichael. The narrative will delve into the philosophy of Malcolm X and his profound influence even after his assassination in 1965. We will cover the founding of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California, exploring their 10-point program, community service initiatives, and their armed confrontations with police. This section will illustrate the long, hot summers of the mid to late 60s, a period of urban uprisings that reflected the deep despair and anger in America's ghettos. The counterculture, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. This section will explore the social and cultural revolution that ran parallel to the political one. It will trace the roots of the counterculture from the Beat generation of the 50s to the rise of the hippie movement. The focus will be on the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, the epicenter of the movement, and the Summer of Love in 1967. We will explore the key tenets of the counterculture, the rejection of materialism and conformity, the exploration of Eastern spirituality, experimentation with psychedelic drugs like LSD, popularized by figures like Timothy Leary, and the sexual revolution. The soundtrack of this revolution, the music of Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, and the Doors, will be a central element. The section will show how this cultural upheaval challenged every traditional American value and created a massive generation gap. The year that shattered America. This entire chapter will be dedicated to the single most tumultuous year of the decade. The narrative will be a chronological account of a nation coming apart at the seams. It will begin in January with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, a military defeat for the communists, but a massive psychological blow to the American public, revealing that the war was far from being won. It will cover Eugene McCarthy's near victory in the New Hampshire primary, leading to President Johnson's stunning announcement that he will not seek re-election. The narrative will then turn to the twin assassinations that spring, the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. in April, which sparked riots in over 100 cities, followed by the murder of Robert F. Kennedy in June, just after he won the California primary, extinguishing the last great hope for many. The section will climax with the chaos of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where anti-war protesters clashed with police in a police riot broadcast live to a horrified nation. One giant leap. The Race to the Moon. Amidst the chaos on Earth, this section will tell a parallel story of unity, achievement, and hope. It will chronicle the American space program from its inception as a response to Sputnik. We will follow the early, pioneering Mercury and Gemini programs, introducing the original astronauts as Cold War heroes. The narrative will build tension around the Apollo program, including the tragic Apollo 1 fire that killed 3 astronauts. The centerpiece will be a detailed, thrilling account of the Apollo 11 mission in July 1969. We will follow Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins on their journey, building to the dramatic lunar landing and Armstrong's immortal first words from the moon's surface. The moon landing will be presented as a moment of profound, shared national pride, a singular achievement that briefly united a deeply divided country. The unraveling. Nixon and the anti-war movement. This chapter covers the end of the decade and the deepening of its divisions. It will begin with Richard Nixon's 1968 victory, a law and order campaign that tapped into the fears of a silent majority, tired of protest and chaos. We will explore how the anti-war movement grew larger, more organized, and more radical in response to Nixon's policies, such as the secret bombing of Cambodia. The narrative will focus on the massive moratorium protests in 1969. The section will climax with the tragic events of May 1970 at Kent State University, where Ohio National Guardsmen opened fire on student protesters, killing 4 and wounding 9. The Kent State Massacre is presented as a horrifying symbol of the nation's divisions, a moment where the government was literally at war with its own children. This thematic chapter will step back and assess the lasting legacy of the 1960s. It will argue that the decade fundamentally reshaped American society in ways that are still potent today. The narrative will trace the origins of the modern feminist movement, spurred by books like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, the environmental movement, launched by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and the gay rights movement, ignited by the Stonewall riots of 1969. It will also explore the political legacy, the destruction of the New Deal coalition, the rise of a new conservative movement, the beginnings of the political polarization that defines our current era, and the profound and lasting decline in public trust in government and other institutions, a direct result of Vietnam and the political assassinations. The Shattered Mirror, Unfinished Business. The final section will serve as a powerful conclusion, tying all the threads of the series together. The central metaphor of the shattered mirror will be invoked to argue that the 1960s forced America to see itself clearly for the first time, its flaws, its hypocrisies, its capacity for both incredible good and terrible evil. It will posit that the decade didn't truly end in 1969, but that its core conflicts are still being fought today. The debates over racial justice, the limits of American power abroad, the role of government, and the clashes between competing cultural values are all echoes of the 1960s. The series will conclude that understanding this chaotic and painful decade is not just a history lesson, it is essential for understanding the unresolved conflicts and forgotten memories that continue to shape the American present.